Well, we all knew this one was coming.
All right. Who wants some? Who's next? Huh? How about it? Who wants some? Huh? Who wants to have a little? You.
On a serious note though, evil races have always been a staple of fantasy, a manifestation of the fears and chaos that heroes are born to fight. But somewhere along the way, we started overthinking them. That orcs need complex cultures and goblins need sympathetic backstories. That evil itself needs an explanation. And in doing so, I think we've lost sight of what makes these creatures powerful. They're not meant to be understood, they're meant to be feared. Today, we're diving into why evil races don't need cultures, why justifying their existence weakens them, and how their power lies in their simplicity and mystery. So to begin, evil races in fantasy settings serve as a necessary shorthand for storytelling. They are a tool that establishes conflicts, stakes, and themes of moral contrast. Their purpose isn't to declare entire species unworthy of nuance, but to create clear antagonistic forces that challenge the heroes. Evil races are useful because they provide narrative clarity. They evoke primal fears and they allow players to feel like genuine heroes fighting unequivocal threats. I think one part that a lot of people get hung up on is the crossover of real-world culture overlaid onto these evil beings. That the baggage of real-world parallels just turns them into caricatures of whatever analog you've used to depict them as. And largely, I agree. I think using real-world analogs for evil races is a creative failure on multiple levels that stems from this strange need people have to justify and explain for the sake of lore and realism. Wizards of the Coast is actually a pretty great example of this, since it seems like they are turning every single race in their settings into playable character races. Even the evil ones you used to not be able to play, they are always having to go back and try to rewrite or constantly stepping into the minefield of creative woes, trying to create unique cultures for every single race. And because players largely want to play, good characters, they have to try and justify these strange anomalies to a culture that is largely evil. In fantasy tabletop games, making all races playable inherently dilutes the purpose of evil races. When every race must be a viable player option, you're forced to bend their original design, stripping them of their mythic, archetypal power and reshaping them to fit into a framework of individuality and moral relativity. Orcs can't just be destructive avatars of chaos anymore. Now they need sympathetic motivations, a nuanced culture, and societal structures so they can function as playable characters. This recontextualization undermines their roles as embodiments of universal fears and forces us to rationalize away their inherent nature. The problem is this: once a race is made playable, it must become relatable. Players will naturally want to know what makes their characters tick, how their race thinks, acts, and fits into the world. Suddenly, the primal essence of an evil race must be rationalized. Why are goblins chaotic? What drives orcs to war? And how do gnolls feel about family? The monstrous ceases to be monstrous. It's reduced to a misunderstood underdog. And while that approach might work for some villains or morally ambiguous groups, it's completely antithetical to the purpose of truly evil races. This shift also creates inconsistency. If orcs can be noble warriors or misunderstood victims, what makes the ones attacking the village any different? Are they evil, or are they just angry? Do they have a reason for their violence, and should the players feel guilty for defending themselves? The clarity of evil as a force, something that the players can unambiguously fight against, is lost in the quagmire of moral relativism. Making every race playable also invites the baggage of over-explanation. Instead of existing as mythic archetypes, these races must now conform to the same standards of realism and depth as the core playable races. But by explaining their motivations, cultures, and histories, you strip away the mysterious and otherworldliness that makes them terrifying in the first place. Evil becomes ordinary, and the players stop fearing what once felt larger than life. The best way to avoid all this is to not allow these races to be playable and resist the temptation to over-explain in the first place. Evil races work because they embody universal fears, chaos, destruction, and the loss of self. Not because they have intricate tax codes or village hierarchies. Explaining too much about their culture doesn't just risk stumbling into real-world parallels, it undermines their power as archetypes. Evil should feel primal, inexplicable, and terrifying in its otherness. The moment you start humanizing it with too much context, it becomes mundane. In a fantasy tabletop game, not every race is meant to be a hero. Some races serve a different narrative purpose, to be the enemy, the chaos, the darkness that pushes the story forward. By insisting that all races must be playable, you rob the game of those clear contrasts, those mythic forces that challenge the players to rise above. Not every creature needs to be humanized. Some are meant to be feared, fought, and defeated, not understood. And when you think about it in this context, you realize why should their cultures even exist? They aren't meant to be a civilization that you understand. They are forces. A swarm of ravenous gnolls doesn't need a well-documented society. They are hunger incarnate. A legion of undead doesn't need laws. They are the inevitability of death, marching without reason or remorse. Their horror lies in their simplicity. They are pure expressions of a singular, terrifying concept. So the more you build an intricate culture behind them, the more you dilute that clarity, and the more risk you run into inadvertently turning them into a real-world parallel with larger implications that you've never considered. Cultures exist to explain and justify the behavior of intelligent beings, and while evil races can be intelligent beings, they don't need that justification. They exist because the world needs them to exist, because they are the chaos to counteract order. A demon doesn't need a reason to sow misery any more than a wildfire needs a reason to burn. By keeping them abstract and elemental, you avoid the pitfalls of stereotyping entirely. There's no chance of accidentally, mimicking real-world traits if you simply refuse to ground them in anything relatable. Orcs as marauding destroyers don't need a culture. Their purpose is destruction. Goblins don't need a political system, they're manifestations of malice and chaos. The less you say about their inner workings, the more room you leave for them to be feared, hated, and fought without hesitation. In fact, not knowing makes them more frightening. Fear thrives on mystery. The mind fills in the blanks with its worst imaginings, creating a horror far more potent than anything you could explain. Keep that ambiguity. Let their evil be vast, unknowable, and absolute. You don't need to justify the embodiment of fear. It just is. Implementing them well just means focusing on what makes them symbolically evil. They shouldn't be just like humans, but mean. Evil races work best as exaggerated mirrors of human flaws, greed, cruelty, and hubris. Think devils embodying unchecked ambition. This elevates them beyond lazy stereotyping. What makes evil races good is their role as existential threats. They don't just want land or wealth. They represent the annihilation of what your heroes value. Orcs pillage not to survive, but because they revel in destruction. Vampires seduce and corrupt because they enjoy dragging the virtuous into damnation. That unrelenting, unapologetic opposition is vital. Fantasy thrives on big stakes and big ideas, and evil races deliver that without demanding a dissertation on the ethics of sword swinging. Evil races embody existential threats because their motivations are not tied to personal gain or power, but to something much more primal, the annihilation or subversion of everything that defines civilization and order. These races become forces of entropy, chaos, and corruption, representing the destruction of the world as we know it. This makes their presence in the campaign far more urgent and meaningful, as the players are not just protecting a city or a nation, they're defending the very idea of order and life itself. What makes them all so potent is their sheer relentlessness. Unlike a human antagonist whose plans can be foiled or whose desires can be swayed, evil races don't negotiate, they simply destroy. They are the unstoppable forces of nature that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be bargained with, or defeated through conventional means. There's no room for complacency or hesitation when facing a threat like this. There's only the constant need for resistance, survival, and ultimately eradication. This sense of scale is crucial. It shifts a conflict from something personal into something universal, where the survival of civilization itself is at stake. The players are no longer dealing with small-scale problems. They're fighting for the survival of everything that they know. The existential threat of an evil race raises the emotional stakes, injecting the narrative with a sense of urgency and danger that is impossible to ignore. By framing evil races this way, the stakes become clear and immediate. If they win, the world as we know it ceases to exist. The destruction they bring isn't personal, it's apocalyptic. This makes the hero's struggle much more heroic, their sacrifices much more meaningful, and their victory more triumphant. It's a fight not just for power or revenge, but for the survival of all that is good and just in the world. In the end, evil races as existential threats provide a clarity and focus that's hard to achieve with more grounded villains. They represent everything the heroes must stand against, embodying the forces of decay, death, and disorder that threaten the very fabric of reality. Their power lies not just in their numbers or their ferocity, but in what they symbolize, a constant reminder that the world is fragile, and without vigilance, it could all be swept away. So to sum things up, stop letting people play these damn races if you're going to make them playable to the characters. The only time players should be playing evil races is if the campaign is meant to be pure evil. Keep with the tone. Ultimately, I think so long as they remain unplayable for the players, then you can actually kind of work in a bit of the culture stuff, but you're just asking for trouble when you let a player take an evil race as the character that totally defies what the race is. That's where the trouble always starts. So, what do you all think about this though? Am I off the mark here? Should we just make all races playable and strive to be better world builders? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. Either way, thank you for watching. I am True, and I hope you enjoyed.